Hello, hello. Welcome to another edition of the Heartwood Stream Series. I'm Dan Pierce, director of the Heartwood documentary and your host of this ongoing interview live stream show. This is our sixth episode now, fifth interview. The first one was just me talking about my Heartwood project, and we've done a whole, a literal handful of really fantastic interviews over the last few weeks, and I am beyond excited to share my interview with you today with none other than Dr. Judith Sayers. For those of you who don't know Dr. Sayers, she is currently president of the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council, which is a non-profit society that supports and provides services to the 14 Nuu-chah-nulth nations on Western Vancouver Island. She was elected chief of the Hupacasath First Nation for 14 years and acted as their chief negotiator for 15 years. Dr. Sayers' educational background includes business and law degrees, as well as an honorary Doctor of Laws from Queen's University. She is an adjunct professor at the Peter Gustafson School of Business and Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria and was recently appointed Chancellor of Vancouver Island University. Dr. Sayers has an extensive history of fighting for First Nations rights and title in the courts of BC and Alberta for nearly 2 decades, as well as in international forums like the United Nations. And Judith has been an outspoken advocate for the protection of old-growth forests in BC and the restoration of Indigenous models of ecological stewardship and resource management. I am thrilled to share our conversation with you today. So without further ado, here is my interview with Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council President, Dr. Judith Sayers. Dr. Judith Sayers, thank you so much for joining me on the Heartwood Stream Series today.
Sure, I'm glad to do so.
It's my pleasure. Why don't you just start by introducing yourself a little bit for those who don't know you? Just tell us a little bit about your background and where you're coming from, as well as maybe a little bit about your
Okay. Aklama Kekinusuqs, Hupacasath Nuu-chah-nulth. My traditional name is Kekinusuqs. I come from the Hupacasath people of the larger Nuu-chah-nulth Nation. And my family originates from both Hupacasath, Uqaluit, and a lot of other Nuu-chah-nulth communities, as well as Cree from Saskatchewan. And so the Hupacasath territory is located on the west coast of Vancouver Island, is part of the larger Nuu-chah-nulth community on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Territory about 232,000 hectares that we've always used since time immemorial, or Iqmut in our own language. And currently I'm the president of the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council. I'm an adjunct professor at UVic in both the environmental studies and business schools. And yeah, I'm on quite a few boards, the Railway on Vancouver Island. I'm on the board of BC Achievement Foundation and BC Ferries. Just got off a few other boards. It was just too much, but yeah, just try and keep busy and my finger in many things.
Yeah, no doubt. I was just sort of doing a little bit more research on you last night and looking at your long list of accomplishments and just things that you've done in the community of First Nations rights and title and advocacy, and it's just absolutely astonishing what you've accomplished in your career so far. Since this is a show about forests and forestry, could you tell me a little bit more about the forests in your territory and what the relationship has been like between Hupacasath people and the forests in your territory, in your Hahuthi?
Okay. So I told you that our territory is about 230,000 hectares. And before the Mamathni, or the people who arrived by boat, came into the Alberni Valley, into our territory, it was largely forested. And many, many, many miles of forests. And we used all parts of the forest, all parts of our territory. We did a lot of seasonal rounds. So we'd move around from different parts of our territory, and depending on where there was fish, and whether there was deer or elk, medicinal plants. So we'd move around, and a lot of what we depended on, especially for medicines and regalia, were in the forests. And a lot of the important areas for spiritual use was in old growth. And there was a lot of old growth in our territories, and there are ecosystems there that could never be replicated. Once those old growth are gone, those ecosystems are gone. And our medicines, our spiritual places, they're great habitat for elk and deer during the winter range for them. And so the forests, of course, was where we gathered, wood for our homes, for our canoes, for our welcoming figures. And, they were very, very important to us. We were very concerned about the forest, and we had forest keepers, and they would go into the forest and look after them. So after a winter storm, for instance, they would go in and they'd clear up any, what's the word for it, any of the trees that had fallen down, and especially falling into the creeks, because you never wanted to stop here the fish that went up the streams to stop their travels to spawning grounds. So the Hupacasath territory has 5 species of salmon, including sockeye, chinook, coho, dog, steelhead. And some, like the chinook, come from Alaska, come all the way down the west coast, and they come up the Barkley Sound and into the rivers and lakes in our territory. So it's a very important place for us and for the fish. And the water and the forests are so integrated, you can't separate them. And because the bears will go, they'll get the fish, take them onto the land, into the forests, and that's what helps nourish the old growth. And there's somewhat of a cycle there. So the forests were so much an important part of our lives, and continue to be so. We used to be able to manage them in ways that we thought was important. Not quite so today, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, when you hear about what the forests were like pre-contact or pre-colonization, words are used like, oh, they were pristine, they're wild. And that may be true, but that didn't mean that they weren't very highly managed and utilized. But it was done in a way that maintained the forest, that maintained the ecological health. And I think one of the aspects of the legacy of industrial logging is how the loss of old growth has impacted indigenous cultures by the loss of those medicines, the loss of the big trees, the big cedars that are needed for carving and whatnot. Could you speak to what has been the impact of industrial logging on Hupacasath territory and Nuu-chah-nulth territories more broadly over the last century? What has that meant for your people and your culture?
Well, there are some things that, there's so many areas of clear cut in our territory that you can't, it'll take them a long time to grow back. And even if an old growth forest is considered 800 to 900 years and longer, it will never come back the same. When trees go back, their life cycles, the circles are further and further apart. So the quality of the wood is not the same, and it just does take forever. So I had mentioned, the old growth forests were home to many animals, eagles in particular, which are very important to us. And so a lot of their habitat has been destroyed. There are times when they might leave up a single eagle tree. But when eagles learn to fly, they usually fly from, like a tree branch to another tree branch, and make their way down, the young eaglets. And you don't see that. And is an eagle supposed to just kind of fly and fall on the ground? And so there's a lot of planning that isn't there anymore. Many of our sacred sites have been just wiped out. And these sacred sites have been used by our ancestors since time immemorial. And we don't really talk about those things, to many people, but, they're part of, the logging. And because there wasn't a lot of consultation until the Haida case in 2004, we never had a say in what was going on in the forest. And so we'd go out to our site and it would be logged, or there might be ribboned, and we try and stop it from happening, but it didn't happen. And so you go further afield to find some of the medicines that might be there. The further you away from people, the stronger your medicines are. And if they're they're the undergrowth to these forests, and you take down the trees, and what's left? I mean, it's those kind of medicines have a hard time to thrive. And oftentimes, there might be value for people to go out and, pick ferns or mushrooms or different things for their commercial use. And they just, or Devil's Club, they just take it all. They don't, and us, we go out, we pick a small patch and move on to the next and move on to the next. So we'd always leave enough to come back to, so you never really destroyed, a whole site. So, you just drive out into the territory, into the lands, and you see so much taken. The other impact it has had, of course, is that when mountainsides are clear cut, when you have water, and we get lots of rain, comes down the mountain. They used to kind of meander down through the trees and make it into the streams, and you have water year round. But once you clear cut it, that water just kind of rushes. It comes right through, because now it ends up in the river. You get flooding, and all of a sudden you don't have water for the length of time, the length of months that we used to, which can affect water flows for fishing. It can affect our sacred pools that we might use, because there's no longer water there year round. There's just so many things, within the forests that we value that are now gone. And I'm watching so-called modern logging day practices. It has not been good for our people. And like I said, we don't have a say in that. We, before the Haida case at the Supreme Court of Canada, we never had a say. And even though we might have a say, the district manager can still approve cutting of our forests. One area that's very valuable to Hupacasath is the Mint Valley. And BC Timber Sales has come in and clear cut many, many, many areas, and what's left? That's what we keep on saying. And it's just shocking and devastating to go into a forested area where you didn't know was being logged and find the devastation there. And, and it's, if you're really in tune, you can just feel the sadness. You can just, it feels like, Mother Earth is crying. It's a really hard thing to witness, because, the BC government and logging companies think it's so much more important to make money. And they think that because you can replant, it's, it'll come back. But it doesn't come back the same way. It takes a long time to come back. And like I said, there's less value in it.
Mm-hmm. I want to shift gears slightly. Can you talk a little bit about the hereditary governance structure in Nuu-chah-nulth culture? Because it's, from what I've learned at least, it's really at the foundation of how Nuu-chah-nulth territories are managed, with clear boundaries and laws. Can you just describe how the system works and why it's been so effective over so many years in meeting people's needs and at the same time protecting the ecosystems that sustain people?
Yeah, so prior to the white man arriving or the people came by boats, we had our own governance systems in place. And we had our own chiefs, or Hakuya in our language. And the Hakuya each had a territory. And within that territory, it was their job to manage the land, to take care of the people. And so there were various roles. I told you about the forest keeper, but there were river keepers. There were just different roles that people had to play in order to help the chief look after his territory. So the chief would be also responsible for looking after any widows or disabled people, and making sure that they had enough food to live on. And so it was really important. So if someone came into your territory and said, hey, I need to go out and get an elk or a deer or do some fishing, the chief would take a certain portion of that. And some people might call it tax, but that he would take a portion of that and he'd give it to people in his village that needed it. So the hereditary chief had a really big responsibility in looking after the territory, looking after the people, and making sure that the laws and protocols were implemented and done properly. So they had a really, really big role, in governance that we don't today. And of course, when the Indian Act was imposed, some First Nations went to the elected systems, but that didn't mean the hereditary systems disappeared. And today you have some that work really well together, the elected chief and council and the hereditary system. And, in some communities, Nuu-chah-nulth communities, nations were amalgamated. And so, like in Hupacasath, there were 3 chiefs, and usually, the chief that had the largest land holding or people became the ta'i, the head chief, and then there was a second and third chief. So there was different placements. Somewhere like Hued, I believe they have 8, and other communities have 10 and 11 chiefs, and so they come together. So like right now up in Mawashet around the Gold River, it's the hereditary chief and 4 other of his sub-chiefs that run the government there. They're one of the few that does. Or somebody like Nuu-chah-nulth has never had an elected chief, and neither has Toquat. So it kind of varies through the Nuu-chah-nulth territories as to the hereditary system. But in the hereditary system, the chiefs would be very careful about their territories and ensuring that they were well managed. And we never thought about climate change and environmental standards. It was just how you maintained the territory. You maintained it at a high standard so that you would always be able to look after your chief, your people for generations to come. And so whoever stepped into those shoes would continue on keeping up those values and keeping up the territory. And so, when the Forest Act and other laws came into place that did away with that, they also did away with any authority the chief and council had, and so provincial laws prevailed. And so today we find ourselves, in territories that have been, ravaged by logging and logging practices. And so much was taken through the years that there's not a lot left. And so trying to protect and keep in place what you can is really important. So when I was chief, we put in place a cedar strategy, and we determined what our needs were, for housing and culture and our carving. And, so we set different areas aside in our territory that nobody could ever touch. And that was kind of what we tried to do to maintain that cedar, but it, wasn't always our say in the end that did it. We have another nation has said that it's their territory, and so then they try and come and take what we protected. And so, there's flaws in all of these systems, but you kind of do what you can do within the system to protect what's important to you. And, forests, and especially old growth, are just so important and integral to our culture.
Mm-hmm. Hupacasath territory was included in the the E&N land grant in the
Yes.
1860s, which has also come to be known as the Great Land Grab of Vancouver Island, which privatized about a fifth of Vancouver Island on southeastern Vancouver Island around the corridor of the E&N Railway. Could you just pick it up and tell the story of this mass privatization of Indigenous territories, which has now come to be owned by Island Timberlands and Timber West, two big logging companies, and just what that privatization has meant for Hupacasath people?
Yeah, so like you said, the government was interested in getting a railway all across Canada, and even that included Vancouver Island. I think it's more like a third of Vancouver Island was taken, and much more so in South Island. And so a lot of the nations down there have very little land, and when they go to land claims and trying to get land set aside, all of it has been privatized, and it's very hard to find crown land to do that. In Hupacasath territory, it takes about a third of our territory, so it kind of slices it. And so the east side is E&N, what was an E&N land grant. And so, of course, when you're looking at huge areas like that, a railway didn't need that kind of land, but that was what they gave them, right? Instead of just a strip, down the island that could build a rail. So when the E&N and other owners afterwards wanted to get rid of some of that land, they sold it. And, like the big logging companies used to be Island Timberlands and what was the other
Timber
railway?
West was the other one.
Timber West,
Yeah.
yes. And they had these huge tracts of land. And I always remember one of my elders talking to me, and he'd say to me, he says, they've taken everything. Next thing you know, they're going to take the mountaintops, but they already have. I mean, like they own, all the way to the top. And you see them, using helicopters, heli logging, and taking all those trees. And originally, way back in the Forest Act, when you wanted a tree farm, you go to the government and you'd say, hey, we want this land for a tree farm. And they would give you more points if you added private lands on. So both Timber West and Island Timberlands added on their private lands. And some of that before them, it was actually Macklin and Bloedel, and then they sold. And so they brought in their private lands as part of their TFL. So a lot of Hupacasath territory and many other First Nations on the island were under Tree Farm License 44. And so in the private lands, they wouldn't have to pay stumpage, but they had to live under the Forest Act and the higher regulations. And of course, through the years, they lobbied and lobbied. The government said that this is our private lands, we shouldn't have to do this. And they got the government to agree to delete their private lands from the tree farm. And we were very, very upset. As Hupacasath, we took the government to court and saying, you can't do that. You didn't consult with us. And the court agreed. They actually agreed that even though this was private lands, we should have been consulted. And they even appealed that, and we won the appeal. Well, actually, they told us to go and consult for 2 years, and if we couldn't get anything done, we had to go back to court, which is what we did. And in the end, we, even though we won, but there had been a transfer from M&B to Brookfield, or I don't even know how that all went. Remember how that all went. But we really didn't get the say in the land that we wanted, which is what we, because we used to work with Macmillan and Bloedel, and we'd tell them, no, you can't log there, or, we need to change this or do something like that. And so we were able to preserve what was important to us mostly. It still had to go to the district manager for final approval, but we at least had a say. But now we have none whatsoever. And, sometimes they lock their gates. And so, we might want to go access. There's a mineral that we need for one of our ceremonies, and it's only in one of our mountains. We can't even get there sometimes because they lock us off. I know one summer my father passed on, and I needed to go get some branches from one of the trees, a specific tree, and I knew where to get it, but they had everything locked off because it was summer and they were logging. but they wouldn't let us go in and gather something simple. I said, give us an hour, we'll be in and out, we know what we're doing. And they wouldn't. And so that's the kind of issues that we have is, we can't always go access our sacred sites, if they've got the, roads cut off. And it's been very, very difficult. And so they also, at times Timber West came to me and said, would you like to buy land? We were a poor First Nation, loved to buy the land, but where do we get the money to do that, from them? And, because they seriously wanted to pass it on to the First Nation, but it just, just wasn't possible. I mean, we did buy, there was a roadway into one of our reserves, and they sold that roadway to us, which was also a good thing. But even raising $25,000 for that was, a bit of a challenge when you don't have a lot of the resources you need. So the ENN land grant had a huge impact on us. And, they cut there's just kind of a straight line through our territory. And part of it is in Great Central Lake. So the lake bottoms belong to the logging companies. And one year they wanted to go in and, because, they raised that lake 12 to 20 feet so that they could, when the pulp mill used to put their pollution into the Barkley Sound, into the inlet, Alberni Inlet, they would have a dam that they would open up so it would dilute what they were polluting with. And anyway, so they raised the lake. And so there was all kinds of trees in there, and some company wanted to come in and take the trees off the bottom of the lake and sell them. And we had no say over it because it was private land. But we knew if they took all those tree stumps out of that area of the lake, they would disturb so much salmon habitat. And anyway, we finally managed to stop that from going on, but it was a huge challenge. And the privatization, I mean, nobody owns the bottoms of lakes and rivers. They just don't do that. But because it's part of the ENN land grant, they were able to do it. So it's complicated, many issues in our territories, but the courts did say that we still have Aboriginal title on those lands. And so that still is something that we have to resolve, and why we tell private landowners, there's still Aboriginal title on your lands, and we really need to resolve this. Kind of scary for them, but it's something that the courts have said.
Mm-hmm. That actually segues really nicely into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is the broader issue of Aboriginal rights and title in BC.
Yes.
And could you talk a little bit about just the burden on First Nations to have to prove their rights and title in court? And, what's it been like having to deal with the BC government and the federal government in litigating these matters?
Oh, BC is one of the most litigious provinces in Canada. We've had to be in court for many, many things. And part of that is because there were no treaties in British Columbia other than northeastern BC, where there's a piece of Treaty 8. And then, of course, we got the early Douglas treaties on South Vancouver Island. And of course, now we have modern day treaties. But so there's been nothing really established. And so every time we turn around, we got to go to court to determine what is an Aboriginal right. I mean, for us, it was our way of life, right? We lived on this land. We used every part of it. We fished and we hunted, we gathered. And all of a sudden, someone comes and asserts themselves over us and asserts their sovereignty and says they've got the say. And, and so then we start talking about this is our right to the land as opposed to our way of life, which is a bit frustrating, but it was the only way we could assert what was important to us, just simply going out and getting fish. And of course, we would use our whole territory. And then they established reserves in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because they wanted to confine us to a small land base. Many of us on the west coast of Vancouver Island were given very small land bases because they said, oh, you get your living and you do most of your stuff on the rivers and oceans. We don't need to give you any land. You're not farmers like some of these other places. And so we have very, very small land bases. Hupacasath, we have 5 reserves, which total 232 hectares of land. 5 reserves, 3 are unusable, and very small. And then they stopped us accessing the rivers and the oceans for our food, and so we really struggle on Vancouver Island, on the coast, because we all have such small land bases. And so you can't exercise your rights very well on your reserve. You got to go out into the territories. You got to do what you need. So every time you turn around, you're having to go to court, even to catch our fish. You know, because there was a sparrow case which we had to fight to say that we had access to fish for food, social, and ceremonial purposes. To today, while we're waiting almost 2 years for the Court of Appeal to confirm a case on commercial rights and our right to commercial fishery, because we've always accessed the ocean and sold our fish, traded our fish, you know, and then we're told we're only allowed to have it for food. And so we're still fighting that battle. And, you know, it's really difficult when you have to spend your whole lives fighting. And I think about that all the time. Why am I always fighting the government? You know, I'd rather be spending all this energy and implementing things and being able to do that, you know, instead of, you know, having to fight with the lumber company to go on our own land where we have title, to pick medicines, or to, you know, take even firewood, you know, and then they want to make us go out and get a license to get firewood. Like, this is our land, this is our territory. And you know, one fellow even went and challenged the government because he was gathering wood for his house, and he had to go to a tribunal, and then that went on to court. You know, we know this land belongs to us. We know that we've been here since time immemorial, and we know that we have the right to the resources. We fought hard to try and get into the Constitution when Trudeau brought it home in 1982. I was part of that battle too. But you know, of course, it wasn't exactly what we wanted. And we ended up with Section 35 and them adding in existing Aboriginal rights. So the right had to be existing as of 1982, which kind of limited us. So every time you turn around and try and get something good, it doesn't always work the way you want it to, because, you know, in the end, it's not our government. And, you know, one of the things that has always killed me in the way of proving Aboriginal title is that it's up to us to prove our title. And it's our land. They came in and took our land. They stole our land. They didn't beat us in war. They didn't, you know, in our ears, they didn't sign a treaty. They didn't discover us because we were here. And, you know, terra nullius, which means the land is barren, doesn't apply to us because we were here and it wasn't barren. So there was no legal method that they took our land. But the courts have said, yes, they came in, they asserted their sovereignty. You know, and what does that really mean? How can they assert their sovereignty over us? And so that was one of the things that really disturbed me in the Truth and Reconciliation, one of the calls to action, because they kind of acknowledge that that's the way it is. And they shouldn't have, you know, it should be up to the government to be proving their right to our lands. So, you know, every time we turn around, we have to prove our right. We have to prove that we belong here. Even, you know, when we were doing the TFL deletion case, we had to talk about our sacred site, which is something that we don't normally talk about. But in order to prove our connection to the land, that was one of the things that we had to do. So that wasn't easy to do. And, you know, of course, we only told the court a certain part of it. But, you know, like traditionally, I would never tell anybody where a sacred site was. Because it was that important to us. I mean, you know, you use the site, and you use branches to make sure there's no footsteps, that no one knew you were there. Yeah, so Aboriginal rights and title have been a long fight in British Columbia. The right to self-government, and do we have that right? You know, Gordon Campbell in the Niska case brought that challenge that there's no such thing and they can't do it. Of course, he lost that case, and Niska went on to finish their treaty that they now live under. and other First Nations have done the same thing. So it's never, and so in 1982, they decided that, okay, enough is enough. Let's sit down and let's negotiate these treaties in British Columbia. And today, what do we have? 5, 6 in the modern treaty day process. And it hasn't been much because the governments want to say, okay, I know Mike Hart was famous for saying you get 5% of your territories and that's it. Out of 95% of your territory, you're allowed to have a small amount of land. People have gone to court. Of course, the Chilcotin got 5% of their land declared to be Aboriginal title lands, and they're still negotiating with BC of what that means. It's been 6 years, 7 years, and we still don't know what that means. And so you continue to do whatever you can to assert your rights and title. And of course, come along the Universal Declaration of Indigenous Rights, which says that we can own, manage, and use the lands that we've used traditionally. And, although that has now been accepted and Prime Minister Trudeau has promised legislation federally to implement UNDRIP, we haven't got there. In British Columbia, they've passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which is supposed to implement UNDRIP and get all our laws in line with UNDRIP, which would mean we have the right to development, the right to stop development, the right to own our lands, the right to have compensation, restitution of our lands. And we're getting nowhere with that. And so, of course, it hasn't been quite a year, but they're just not implementing what they say they're going to. And so that's very, very difficult when we have our own right of self-determination under which means we can politically self-define ourselves, because they're always trying to make us go into these groups and say that you belong to this group and you have to work with this group. Simple things like that. It's a continual battle, and I had really hoped, when I was young and started working on the treaty process, I was really hoping that in my lifetime, in a short period of time, maybe 10 years, we'd have a treaty and my children would be implementing the treaty and, living from the rights and benefits of that. And yet now they become the warriors. They're the ones that are out there fighting it.
Mm-hmm. I've been actually working with Nuu-chah-nulth a little bit, producing some fundraising videos for their title and rights court case. And I've heard a little bit about what they're going through in court from Jack Woodward, their attorney. And
Yes.
he was in court the day that the DRIPA Act passed. And at the same time, BC lawyers were pleading that Nuu-chah-nulth had abandoned their territory and that was the position that they were taking. Have you followed the Nuu-chah-nulth case at all? And are you able to speak to the significance of their title case?
Well, Nuu-chah-nulth is one of our 14 Nuu-chah-nulth nations. And Nuu-chah-nulth is one of those nations that have always had a hereditary chief, a Heartwood, never, elected a chief. And so I think that is, really strong, for their case, that they've always had the same governance throughout the years, that they've never accepted Canadian law. And so they were in the treaty process. We all were, we all had hopes and dreams that this would happen. And we realized it wasn't going to happen in the way we wanted, what we wanted. And so Nuu-chah-nulth went to court, a small nation on its own, and went to court for title. And BC has been raising every possible barrier to stop them from proceeding to that title case. Which is just unreal when you think about it. I've been in a few meetings with them, with the Attorney General, trying to say what's going on here, and why is this happening? And we have DRIPA that should be recognizing this title, but like we said, we just even though they put this law in place, they're not living up to it. which is so unfortunate. I don't know all the details, but I've tried to help them politically to just get their case into court, and they're trying to do things a bit differently because Chilcotin took, I can't remember how many days in court, over 300 anyway, and it's such a long, onerous process to go through, and so they've been trying to come at this differently, but still come out with the same ruling that they have Aboriginal title in their territories. If you ever go up into Nuu-chah-nulth, their hills have been stripped. It's amazing how much timber has been taken out of there, and that affects their fishery. And like one of the neat things about Nuu-chah-nulth is that there was a stream, a fish-bearing stream, a rich fish-bearing stream that belonged only to the chief, to Walter Michael, and before him Albin, and before him his father. And these are strong evidence of title. And so it's really exciting to watch Nuu-chah-nulth in that battle and trying to find all that evidence that they need to prove the use of their territories, how much they use it. They haven't given up anything. But, the fact that there's development there doesn't mean we gave up anything. It's just that we couldn't continue to practice on that piece of land the way we used to because of colonization, because of the money has become more important, and we know that we can manage things a lot better in our territories, that would be better for climate change, better for the environment, that will sustain the land for many generations to come because of the way it goes. There's not going to be much left for the 7 generations down the road.
Yeah, and I will post in the comments the fundraising page for the Nuu-chah-nulth title case and the videos that we produced. And I'm also hoping to get Archie Little on this show in the near future to get him talk about it as well. Moving on. So recently, the BC government over the last year or so did a public input process about old growth policy in BC. That panel came back and released a report very recently, which spoke to the need for a paradigm shift in the way that we manage old growth in BC. And the BC government reacted by implementing some logging deferral areas in various places across the province, one of which was in Clayoquot Sound in Nuu-chah-nulth territory. At the same time, or in reaction to that, some First Nations were concerned that the BC government had not adequately consulted them on this process. So could you just react to that report if you read it, but more importantly, the Clayoquot Sound logging deferrals and just your thoughts on the consultation process?
Okay. Forestry has always been a volatile issue in British Columbia due to the amount of it and the fact that it was usually these big corporations. It wasn't until, maybe the last 20 years that First Nations have really had a toehold into the industry. And some have accepted forest license, some have accepted woodlots. And, I know Hupacasath, we have a woodlot, and we incorporated higher standards, much higher standards than in the Forest Act. And we've long been concerned about what's been going on in the forestry, the impact on fishery, the impact on the environment and the water. And, we've been, and in fact, in the early days before the NDP was the government, Minister Scott Fraser, who's no longer minister, but he was one of our biggest champions for proper logging. Everybody knows the history of what happened in Clayoquot Sound. And, the big fight that went on out there, and to be able to have higher logging practices and the higher standards that they have out there because of it. And, there's a lot of forest companies that left the area because they couldn't live up to those standards. And so we've been trying to work with the government to stop logging, such as the Nuu-chah-nulth and, from the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council, we've been asking for shared management or joint decision making to manage the forests so that we would have the same say as the government did. And of course, nothing. And, under the new Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, there is a mechanism in there for you to negotiate joint decision making or consent before decisions. And this government has not started to do so, even though we've asked. And basically, Ministry of Forests is saying we don't have a mandate. So I went to appear before this committee that was put together to look at logging and old growth in British Columbia. And I brought that up, that look, we can do joint decision making. There's a mechanism, a legal mechanism now. We need to do this, and went through the declaration on all of the areas that the government has to start living up to. The biggest thing that the Nuu-chah-nulth nations have been saying is they want to manage their own forests. They want to be able to say if old growth is taken or how much of it is taken, and just having that total control over their areas and using higher logging standards than anybody has anywhere else. And so that's kind of what, and so that was voluntary to get these two gentlemen to come into your territories. And so I gathered up as many interested Nuu-chah-nulth, and we sat and we talked to them for a couple of hours. It's not the kind of the real conversations that you need to have and sit down and talk about, on the ground, basic kind of management practices that you'd like to. But at the same time, you don't want to stop the conversation, and the government is putting this process in place, and you need to take a part of it, even though it's not the consultation that you want. And of course, the report comes out, and there's some recommendations in there that the government may or may not implement. And they set aside 51 trees, in British Columbia, I believe it was 51. And then these areas of set-asides, like you said, but I don't know how they got to that point. I don't know. They didn't, and as president of the Tribal Council, they don't come to me anyway. They go to each of the First Nations, and obviously they went to Clayoquot Sound. But I don't think they went to Hupacasath and said, hey, is there any area you want to set aside? I don't know how they chose those areas. And, in that fact, I don't think people were consulted fully, and was their, again, it was their priorities, their ideas, their wanting to do those kinds of things. So I don't blame people for saying that we weren't properly consulted. It was just one of those groups that go around the province, collect, from people ideas, and they bring up recommendations. And it may not be as comprehensive. And if you look at what the goal of the government or the responsibility of the government is, that they need to go to every First Nation and talk to them. And in my opinion, they now need their consent, a free, prior, and informed consent, as opposed to, just this consultation and these groups. So I don't blame First Nations for saying it's not the right thing, because, our forests are so key to us, and the issues we've had with forest fires and beetlewood and so many things. It's very frustrating as First Nations to see the government have these same approaches over and over again. It's somewhat of that systemic racism that we see, that they think that's how to find the answers, instead of sitting down with First Nations saying, okay, we have problems, how do we fix them?
Yeah. Just sort of circling back to, staying in Clayoquot Sound for a little bit longer. The nations of Clayoquot Sound, Taloquiet, Ahousaht, Heshquiet, to my knowledge, have really been at the forefront of Indigenous-led forest conservation initiatives and land use planning. I've read the Ahousaht land use plan, and it's very exciting and inspiring. Can you just talk a little bit more about sort of the progress that's been made in Clayoquot Sound and elsewhere in Nuu-chah-nulth territories towards developing indigenous-made land use planning and conservation areas such as tribal parks and salmon forests. Could you talk about that, some of those projects?
Yeah, I can. It's amazing. I mean, it's a huge area, but with what happened in Clayoquot Sound, nations knew that they had to get organized, and putting land use plans in place was key and important. We did the same thing in Hupacasath, and the government just told us it was a consultation document. They didn't make it a land use plan, even though they did Vancouver Island land use plan. They didn't really talk to First Nations about that. I know we did put in a submission about 40 pages, but nothing was ever taken into consideration in Violet. And so, it was our way of saying, hey, we know our territory like the back of our hands. We utilize it. We know where the important things are. We know where bear dens are, wolf dens. We know the migratory paths of elk. We need to manage this territory. We need to, set aside this old growth areas. And so people put in place land use plans. And so, the three nations in the north, the Nuu-chah-nulth, the Nuu-chah-nulth, and the Hupacasath, have decided to implement what they're calling salmon managed forests areas. And so they want to have the forest managed in their territories according to the salmon. And this has never been done before. And so we're pulling together our own laws that are there. We just have to gather up all the information we can and start enforcing them and working with government to set aside. And so, it's not that the government's not too, they're not impressed, but they say immediately, okay, well, that means we're going to have to take some of the area out of the tree farm license. And so we'll have to compensate forest companies. That's the first thing they think about. Instead of saying, hey, this is great. I mean, we can start looking after the land better, environmental standards are going to be better. And so that's going to be some time. But I think it's something that's worth fighting for. And, these three nations that are leading this are also working with Coast Environmental Law and pulling together these laws and just finding ways forward with it. And other First Nations, such as Hupacasath, is buying up all of Tree Farm License 44, partnering with the company there, Western Forest Products. And so and that's going to be their way of dealing with managing their own forest. If we own it, we can do what we want. But of course, as you know, when you get a license from the government, you're expected to cut so much wood and, do certain things that may be contrary to how Hupacasath wants to manage it. So I think all of our Nuu-chah-nulth nations are trying to do what they can. I mean, when Clayoquot Sound wanted no more of their old growth taken, that's when they rose up. We got a lot of supporters, and I mean, that's a very famous story. And so everybody else is doing something that we can. As Hupacasath, we fought the deletion of TFL 44. And so people are, and of course, they're doing what they want to do for their own territories, which is really important and needs to be continued because this is our land, and we're trying to assert our stewardship that we've always had for the land and ensuring that the forests are taken care of is just fundamental to all of that.
Mm-hmm. I've got two questions left for you, if you don't mind.
Okay.
I want to touch briefly on the climate crisis because I just feel like no conversation about forestry or really anything else these days is complete without touching on the realities of climate change that we are facing now, not just in the future, but now. Could you speak to how climate change is already starting to manifest itself in Nuu-chah-nulth territories, like what you're already seeing in terms of impacts, and what role do you feel forests will play in fortifying ourselves and mitigating the worst effects of climate change, as well as combating climate change?
Yeah. So due to logging practices, temperatures have risen. anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees where there's clear cuts. You know, we all know the famous Cathedral Grove as you drive into Port Alberni. And you used to be able to drive from Port Alberni, go into Cathedral Grove, and it'd be 10 degrees less easily. Now it's 3 or 4 degrees because they've taken out so much of those old trees around the park. And it's really noticeable. So you can see that anywhere in the Nuu-chah-nulth territories that temperatures have risen. And of course, that's global warming. But it's also because we've taken away the forest cover and the undergrowth. And so it's gone and it increases. On the flip side of that, droughts, you know, we get, you know, the droughts are really, really, really hard on the trees. And so, you know, there rots root rot. Anyway, and so the stability of the trees isn't there. So you get the winds in the winter and they're falling over. Also, you know, we just get so many more wet days. And so when the trees, I mean, you just see them, those big trees, and they're surrounded by puddles of water. And again, that's rotting the roots. And the stability of those beautiful old trees, you know, any kind of trees is hard on them. So, you know, the lifespan of trees is going to change. And, you know, we might just be losing trees just from that alone. And, you know, trying to get carbon sinks and carbon credits instead of taking our trees has also been a really long battle. I know one negotiation we had, we were trying to say, well, you know, we want carbon credits. And they're saying, we don't have those in place yet. I said, we know, but let's negotiate them. And if it happens, then we get the credits. If it don't, it's our loss. But the governments wouldn't do that. So just watching the change in temperatures, you know, and we're just getting greater winds, and so more trees are going down. And part of the growing winds, of course, is that they're taking down the trees, and those that are left standing aren't wind firm. And so we're not doing things properly so that we can get those trees stronger with the wind. You know, we should be able to, you know, if we're looking for solutions to climate change, we need to have that forest cover. We need to have them to help us to take down the temperature as we move forward. I think that's going to be a really key role. And I don't really think that when people are managing forests that they're thinking about climate change. They're thinking more about money and the stumpage the government's going to get, and you know what they're going to sell that for. Sending it overseas and selling raw logs is, you know, happens in our territory all the time. Seeing those big ships leaving the Alberni harbor and, you know, full of raw logs. And, you know, it just, you know, it really devastates me to see that, because you know what they used to be, you know, and what role they played, you know, within our territory. So I don't know, there's so many issues, I think, with climate change that we haven't addressed yet, that we still need to address. And it has to be a key part of the management of our forests.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Sorry, do you mind if I just toss one more question in there for you? The other
Sure.
thing that I meant to ask you about earlier actually was that, you know, for those people who are concerned or interested in protecting old growth, in saving what's left, of especially the highest value endangered old growth that's left, one of the complicated realities we have to face is that many First Nations have tree farm licenses or woodlots that include old growth, and those nations actually rely on the revenue from their forestry operations, you know, and so it's an interesting question. What I'm curious to know is, what do you think is the way out of that situation for those of us who are interested in protecting old growth but want to do it in a way that is just and fair, and you know, it would be pretty hypocritical to go to First Nations and say, that's it, you can't log any more old growth, when settler logging companies have logged 97% of it. What's the way out of this situation? How do we save old growth in a way that is fair and just for First Nations, and that they're able to sustain their economies without logging old growth?
That's a really tough question that each community, each First Nation is going to have to determine on their own. And of course, the problem is that not enough people go out to meetings and when they make those decisions, or they don't want to go to those meetings because they get too controversial. And decisions might be made to cut the old growth with, a handful of members or not even 50% of the members. Because you're always going to have people in the communities that want to make money. And of course, old growth makes that money. And no matter how hard you try, people make those decisions. And I don't know how we can change that. I think that we just need to start educating our children on the importance of those forests and old growth and what we did and why we're doing that. The importance of sacred sites. I mean, we have to start, for some people don't do some of the traditional practices anymore. So they don't feel, that connection to the earth. And so, this is an internal thing for our First Nations to be looking at. I once had a real fight in my community. They wanted to put a woodlot on a sacred mountain, and our elders have always said that if there's a sacred site on the mountain, the whole mountain needs to be protected. And I lost that. I was just crushed because I worked closely with those elders, and I knew that, but there was nothing I could say in my community that would convince them to not do that. I mean, if I had been chief, I wouldn't even brought it to them. But that wasn't my choice, and so I was fighting from the outside. So I think it's an educational process to be talking to our communities about the importance of old growth on the landscape, on the ecosystems, what it is we're losing, and outside of the pressure of making money. This is something you got to sit down and work out and talk about before you have to make the decision of whether to cut them. And yeah, but you're always going to have some of those communities. And I think that's why, if we have our own management systems in place, that we can make those decisions, or, take 10% of the old growth. I don't know, it's a really hard struggle to make those decisions.
One of the things that Ken Wu talked about was the need for, financing for First Nations to support Indigenous businesses so that they have other options and that there's financing for those other options other than just, going in and doing what they need to do to support their people economically. But I want to end on a more hopeful note. This is my last question for you, Dr. Sayers. Describe your most hopeful vision of the future. What does that look like to you in terms of, government and Indigenous relations, in First Nations involvement in the economy, ecosystem management, whatever you want to talk about. Just give me your most hopeful, utopian vision of the future, and we'll end on that.
Well, I think that we need to have enough of our territories set aside for our use, that there are lands, totally, our resources, water included, water, air. We need to have that secure, and not just our reserve land base, which for Hupacasath is 0.001% of our traditional territory. That's just not acceptable. We have to have a large area set aside, and we have complete say over that, complete management over that, that we're able to do sustainable development. And what we were just talking about, if we had carbon credits, we wouldn't have to cut down those old growth trees. We need to have those kinds of things in place so that we can continue to use our territory the way we always have, following the footsteps of our ancestors, that we can go out and use those sacred sites, because those are power places. They bring power to you as an individual. The ability to continue to exercise our rights and, go strip that cedar tree, go get those fish, go get those medicinal plants. in a way that's going to be healthy. Like a lot of our plants out there are not healthy anymore because of the pollution. Um, that we have a large role in restoring and rehabilitating our territory because it needs it, right? There's just been so much devastation to the land and to the water, and we need to have a role in doing that. And I think all of that takes partnerships and relationships and working together with people. Because some of us, like Ken Wu and all the other people who are fighting and standing up for old growth, we need those allies. We need people who understand us and who have their own desires and yeah. I'm just hoping that uh, this would happen fairly soon, so that um, I don't have to keep fighting every single fight, and that my children are able to benefit from that. That they can do the kind of economic development, that sustainable things that we love, clean energy, or other things. And yeah, I just I'd be able to retain a way of life that's not threatened all the time. And so those are the kinds of things that I look for sure.
Dr. Judith Sayers, thank you so much for joining me on the Heartwood Stream Series today. I truly appreciate it.
Yeah, nice to spend some time with you, Daniel. Thank you.
All right.